Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the top grades. This one is aimed at grades 7, 8 and 9 and it's looking at fate in Romeo and Juliet. We will be reading parts of an essay by a wonderful student called Thomas, who has sent this essay in for me to make a video. And I'm going to use my translation of the mark scheme for grades 7, 8 and 9. So this is what you will need for AO1. I'll also teach you everything you need to know from AO2 and then obviously AO3, the context. I've also tried to copy and paste the essay for you and put it in the community tab. Looks like YouTube's not so happy with that. So if that doesn't work, I will photograph it and upload the photos for you so you can read the whole essay and take notes as you wish. Okay, let's begin with AO1. The most important thing you need to do is have a well-structured argument. There has to be something you want to prove, and then all the paragraphs have to work together to prove that. And this is called a thesis, the point of view that you want to prove. Now, at grades 7, 8 and 9, you will have more than one thing the writer wants to show. So your thesis needs to have at least 2 parts. Let's have a look at how Thomas starts. He's looking at the theme of fate and the extract is the prologue. In Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare presents the story of the tragic lovers as undoubtedly and irrevocably tied with fate and predestination, illustrating the two committed to their love in spite of their supposed fates. Okay, so that is the first part of his thesis. He's arguing that Shakespeare wants to show that love is somehow going to overpower despair at the fate that each lover has, which is going to be, as we know from the prologue, death. Here is the next part of the thesis. Ultimately, the writer aims to encourage the audience to prioritize love and good nature over bitterness and conflict by displaying fate's workings with the ancient feud in leading to the demise of the pair, thus using fate as a device to convey his message. So there we have the second part of the thesis, and the examiner is already thinking, okay, this student is going to be at least a grade 7. Now, I'm going to show you why having 2 parts to your thesis is so beneficial. Look at this. The essay is going to explore at least 2 interpretations of the character or the author's purpose. So by having a 2-part thesis, you've already given 2 parts to the author's purpose, again confirming to the examiner that you're going to get a grade 7 or more. Okay, the next crucial thing you can do to control the way the examiner already thinks of you as a grade 7 writer is to write about the full task, including the ending of the text. So it's quite useful not to wait to the end of your essay to write about the ending of the text. You can write about the ending much earlier because it will link to the author's purpose. So this is a really long revision essay. We're not going to read it all in this video, but I've shrunk it here so you can see as I scroll down, everything in yellow here is a reference to the ending. We'll look at that in detail in a minute. This again is a reference to the ending, which we'll look at in detail in a minute. And then we have a final reference to the ending, and that all that comes before the conclusion at the end. So as the examiner goes through the essay, they know this is a response to the full task, and they know the candidate, Thomas, is thinking about the ending all the way through and linking it to the author's purpose. So he is guaranteed to get at least a grade 7, absolutely without question. Let's have a look at what he's actually written. So we're looking at Romeo after he's been banished to Mantua. Romeo suggests their woes shall serve for sweet discourses. The noun woe implies and invokes regret at their inevitable fates and emphasizes the distress caused by their separation. Well, that's all right, but it doesn't really link us to the author's purpose yet, so it's not a top analysis. Furthermore, the reference to future sweet discourses reminds the audience of their fate, directly linking to how they will only be able to enjoy their love in death. Their fate will allow them to be together. So this effect on the audience does begin to give us a sense of the author's purpose here. Okay, it's not fully explained here, but as you can see, his next paragraph begins with, furthermore, this again ties with the writer's purpose as he, and so on. So we know that Thomas is linking his observations to the writer's purpose all the time. He's going to get the grade. You will notice a lot of Thomas's paragraphs begin with the same connective, furthermore. Here are two more examples from earlier in the text. Furthermore, the use of, furthermore, the fact, the pair. Now, you might think that examiners would get really impatient with this lack of variety and mark you down, but not consciously, they won't. What they're looking at here is a structure of your argument and thinking, well, does this paragraph need to be here in order for this to build on what went before? And the answer with Thomas's essay is yes, and the fact that he's using boring repetition of connectives shouldn't count against him. You can, of course, use different ones. That would be even better, but it's not essential. Right, here is another place that Thomas deals with the ending. We also see the sonnet repeated at the end of the play in Act 5, Scene 3, following the pair's deaths. This again helps to convey Shakespeare's message of encouraging the audience to prioritise love over conflict. So what he's getting at here is that the sonnet form is a love poem, and by deliberately placing this visible indication of love at the end of the play, it suggests, or Shakespeare suggests, that love will conquer all, and we, the audience, must prioritise love over any kind of conflict in our lives. So again, this comes back to Shakespeare's purpose, and he's dealing with the ending much before the end of his essay. That is a grade 7 and above skill. Okay, he actually does that a third time. So Romeo's death occurs soon after, and his wish to assume control of the situation is evidenced not only by his unity with Juliet in death, but also by his ability to change the attitude of the parents at the end of the play, as they accept their children have become sacrifices of their enmity and endeavour to repair relations. So he's taken a quotation from the very end of the play and suggested that Romeo's death has brought that reconciliation, that repair of relations about. So that's a really sophisticated argument. He's hinting also that perhaps Romeo might have had this in mind when he committed suicide, although he hasn't fully explored that view. Right, that last example where we had the embedded quotation from the end of the play is also evidence of quotation used to back up the argument and interpretation, and it's also a really well chosen quotation. So already, just from the brief extracts I've shown you, we know he's got everything for grade 7 and above in A01. Okay, let's look in detail at what you get marks for when you're writing about the quotations. Well, you need to focus in on individual words. Your teacher might have told you to zoom in, and that's true, and we've seen Thomas do that already. You sometimes find more than one interpretation of the same quotation. We'll look for that. And you interpret how the form of the text shapes the way the author wants readers to understand it. Now, this is the hardest one students do. It's the one that's most difficult. They ask, what is the form? Well, in Romeo and Juliet, there are two forms that we're going to look at in this essay. One form is that it is a tragedy, and therefore it follows some of the rules of tragedy. And the other form that we're going to look at is this repeated use of the sonnet within the play. Let's have a look at that now. So this is Thomas's first reference to the sonnet, and he's going to point out that the prologue is in fact written as a sonnet, which you remember is traditionally a poem about love. Furthermore, the use of form in the prologue is pertinent. The use of the Elizabethan sonnet, commonly used in Romanticism, is repeated when the pair meet in Act 1, Scene 5. This demonstrates the importance of love in the play and the strength of the pair's affection. So that's not bad. Thomas has given us two purposes for the sonnet. One, to show the importance of love, and the other were to show the strength of that love in Romeo and Juliet. However, what he doesn't tell us is how Shakespeare wants us to view that love. So there is an interesting discussion to be had, and I think whatever the essay, you need to have this discussion. Is Shakespeare promoting this teenage love as something to be admired, or is he saying that actually this love led to their own tragic fate, and if they hadn't been so keen to rebel against their parents' wishes, they would have led much happier lives? Because one of the things you have to consider is that wealthy parents in Shakespeare's day would have seen it as their duty to arrange a really good match, to arrange the perfect husband for their daughter. And that perfect husband would be somebody with power and influence from a family even more wealthy and powerful than their own. So simply allowing the pair to choose who they marry was actually not something that rich Elizabethans would have seen as wise. And many contemporaries would have seen this play as proof that Shakespeare believed allowing people to marry for love was foolhardy. Now, of course, you don't have to agree with that, but if you mention it and then prove why you don't agree with it, well, obviously you have more than one interpretation, which you remember was a key way here to get the marks in AO1. But having more than one interpretation also occurs in AO2, so it's really valuable to you to have this kind of interpretation. Now, I gave you that interpretation using some context from the time. I talked about the contemporary reader. So again, having more than one interpretation gets me the grades in AO3. And as you can see at the beginning of AO3, you write about more than one interpretation. So your thesis argues why one interpretation is better than another. Yes, so by the end of your essay, you're going to say whether Shakespeare agreed with the arranged marriage that his contemporary audience would have seen as wise, or whether he uses the play to attack it and say, actually, if they've been allowed to marry for love, their lives would have ended happily and the families would have been reunited that way. It's up to you to decide which way you go, but having both those interpretations forces the examiner to give you 7 or above. Easy, isn't it? Let's now look at the second reference to the sonnet. So we've read this before. We also see the sonnet repeated at the end of the play. And by placing this romantic sonnet at the conclusion of the play, it helps to enforce how love always comes to the fore over conflict despite the pair's deaths. So he's starting to suggest that love will triumph no matter what, and this would help Thomas pursue an interpretation where he says Shakespeare rejects the contemporary audience's view that arranged marriage is the sign of a really proper parent. Right, well, although he's done everything he needs to get into the grade 7 and above for all the assessment objectives, there is a slight issue here. Romantic with a capital R is a reference to a period in British literary history from around 1780 to, let's say, 1830. And therefore, it's anachronistic, out of time, anachronistic to start mentioning the romantics here. Because the way that Thomas has placed it here suggests that audiences in Shakespeare's day would have known that the sonnet was a romantic form. And you can't do that. You can't take something out of context like that. It's a small quibble. If you just wanted to show that the sonnet was romantic because it was connected to love, then you would have romantic without the capital R. With the capital, it refers to that specific period in literary history. Okay, when you look at context, you use details from the author's life or society at his time, the contemporary society, or literature at the time to back up your interpretation. Now this means you need more than one example of context because details is plural. So let's look at Thomas's analysis of the prologue. The verb crossed, he's talking about the star-crossed lovers, links with the principle of the three fates and the weavers of destiny, crossed, implying their destinies have been interwoven. This helps to convey to the Elizabethan audience the inevitability of their deaths, given Anthropos, the last of the three fates, determined death. So this is a really useful use of Greek mythology. The three fates all had names, and the final one who cut the thread was called Atropos. Well, fine, but you're not really getting any marks yet until you link that to why Shakespeare has done it. Let's see how he does it. Therefore, not only do we see the link between fate and the outcome of the play, but are also demonstrated the writer's intention to encourage the audience to consider the importance of good nature and love over conflict. By presenting the audience the outcome of the play from the start, he instead wants the audience to focus on their own attitudes and the attitudes of the characters. So that's a pretty strong interpretation. Thomas is arguing that, well, we already know the characters' fates, and therefore we're not watching the play to find out what happens. Instead, we're trying to find out why it happens and compare that to our own attitudes and see if we act and believe the same way as the characters do. Okay, that's pretty cool, isn't it? He could have gone a step further and suggested specifically what Shakespeare wanted us to think. In other words, did he want us to identify with Romeo and Juliet and their passion for each other, or did he want us to see it as immature and dangerous? Again, it doesn't matter which interpretation you have, but considering both interpretations, as you remember, gets you the higher grade. Right, there are three things left to show you. One is how Thomas deals with the structure. The other one is some advice about terminology, and then finally we'll look at the conclusion. So let's start with the structure. You interpret how the structure of the text shapes the way the author wants readers to understand it. Now, because the play begins with the sonnet, the prologue, and it ends with the sonnet as the families are reconciled, and we also have that sonnet in the middle where the lovers meet, in a way, Thomas has already dealt with the structure, and he's also said why it begins with the sonnet and why it ends with the sonnet. So he's already getting into this band for structure, but he has more. Hopefully you've noticed in several of my videos I keep talking about how writers use contrast and juxtaposition, and Thomas has picked up on this all the way through this scene, but instead of using the word contrast and opposition, he's using this idea of oppositional forces. And I've just highlighted oppositional. Let's find out where opposition happens again. There it is again. There it is again. There's a fourth one here. All the way through those four examples, Thomas keeps linking the idea of these oppositional forces in the play, such as light and dark, for example, to Shakespeare's purpose. So he's foreshadowing its importance later on in the text and introduces us to the family conflict, helping Shakespeare to emphasize its significance in causing the pair's deaths. So all the way through, he is saying Shakespeare is introducing this structural feature of opposition in order to show how the feud is so responsible for the lovers' deaths, rather than the lovers' immaturity and defiance of their parents' wishes. Right, it now just remains for us to look at the conclusion and see if he's able to link this to the author's purpose. Therefore, Shakespeare is intending to convey the importance of love and goodwill to others over conflict, and is encouraging his audience to take control of their own attitudes, thus using fate as a device in the play's plot to further the pair's demise and to encourage the audience to take control of their own free will to avoid a recurrence of Romeo and Juliet's fates. So that's a pretty good conclusion. He's got at least two reasons in there. He's got a quotation, which I love. I always tell my students try and get quotation into your conclusion. And he's linked it all to Shakespeare's purpose. There is something missing for me, because we could easily read the play, the tragedy of the play, as a result of the characters exercising their own free will, and Thomas hasn't really proven how that tragedy doesn't back up the audience's expectation that marriage should be arranged and parents should choose the right partner for their children. It's easy to do that, and Thomas could do that very easily. He just hasn't done it here. If we return to AO3, your conclusion sums up why you have picked one interpretation as more convincing than another. It shows why your thesis is correct. Now for me, Thomas hasn't done that because he hasn't fully explored two interpretations. And for that reason, I'm not going to give him top marks, even though he's written over 1,500 words, which is more than you could write in the time in the exam, I expect. It's certainly be a tall ask for 99% of students. However, he's got everything for the 7 and probably the 8. I'm quite confident that this would score a grade 8 in an exam if you're able to write that much. Now, the advantage of this video, where I've just zoomed in on key bits, is that you can see what the most important parts of the essay are. It should prove to you that you don't have to write this many words. Now, I've realised I didn't talk to you properly about subject terminology. So many teachers have decided that subject terminology is all about nouns, verbs, adjectives and adverbs. And I get many requests on YouTube to explain this, but it isn't. The examiners really don't want you to write this. You won't lose marks for it, but listen to this. Although the noun debt connotes a cost or repayment, well, putting the word noun in there doesn't help us understand anything. It would mean exactly the same as if we said, although the word debt connotes a cost or repayment. And so just naming it as a noun is pointless. You're not using subject terminology in any way that's helpful. So see that here. Some consequence yet hanging in the stars. The verb hanging emphasizes the precarious nature of the events. Well, it does, but the fact that it's a verb is irrelevant to the point you're making. So you could just as easily have said, the word hanging emphasizes. Or, in fact, you could have started the sentence with, hanging emphasizes the precarious nature of the events. We didn't need the verb or the word at all. So this is bogus terminology. Because it doesn't link you to any sort of interpretation. Well, all right, what is terminology that is linked to interpretation? Okay, I'm going to show you with the words in bold, and terminology just means this: the words you need in order to write about literary texts. The words you need to write about the interpretation. Let's have a look. This again refers to Shakespeare's key intention. So writing about the writer's intention is relevant in every single literature essay, and that links to the purpose, so it's always terminology. To show the power of love and its positive impact on us, I think that should say, as a society. Now, writing about the society that we're in, or the society that the contemporary readers were in, is always a way to explore Shakespeare, the writer's purpose. So talking about society will always be terminology that links to the poet's purpose. By teasing the audience repeatedly with references, well, talking about how the audience reacts to the text is always linked to the writer's purpose. So audience is always terminology that we use to write about any text. With references to the lover's inevitable fate, such as this dark foreshadowing of death, Shakespeare is able to maintain interest. Well, there's his purpose, and foreshadowing will occur in nearly every text that you study. It is therefore terminology linked to a writer's purpose. It always will be, whatever the text. Which leads them to his final message. Well, that again is always going to be the writer's purpose. This phrase, final message, you could always use in any text that you're writing about, and so it's always terminology. And similarly, we will always have conflict, as I mentioned earlier, through contrast and juxtaposition, and that's always linked to the writer's purpose. So hopefully you can see what terminology is, and it happens naturally in your writing. It's not a feature that you have to spot like nouns, adverbs, adjectives, metaphors, simile. Yet, if you're writing about why the writer has used this particular metaphor, go for it, you'll get the marks. Or why they've used the simile, go for it. But the fact that it is a metaphor and the fact that it is a simile, if you don't link that to the writer's purpose, it's not a judicious use of terminology. Now, hopefully, just by showing you these two paragraphs, you can see that when you're writing about literature with the right vocabulary, you'll be using this stuff all the time. You can always write about the plot, you can always write about the devices that the author uses, and so on. Well, hurrah, you've now seen everything you need in AO1, AO2 and AO3. You're good to go, you're good to get grade 7 or above. See you soon on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe.